Welcome to our deep dive into China's economic trajectory. You've shared some fascinating research with us, a mix of expert analysis, firsthand accounts, and real-world examples. So we're excited to unpack it all and help you make sense of this complex landscape and its potential global impact.
Yeah, it's a landscape shrouded in a bit of mystery, wouldn't you say? Understanding China's economic influence requires us to look beyond those flashy headlines and official figures and grapple with some inherent information challenges.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are intentionally hidden. One of the first things that jumped out from the research was this China data dilemma. It seems like even seasoned China analysts have to get pretty creative to get a clear picture of what's actually happening.
They absolutely do. See, traditional economic metrics, the kind we might rely on in other countries, are often unreliable in China. Our expert explains that there's a systemic issue of data manipulation tied to political incentives. Local officials are under immense pressure to meet those ambitious growth targets set by the central government, which can lead to, shall we say, some creative accounting.
So it's not just about economic performance, it's about political survival too. If promotions and rewards are tied to hitting those targets, I can see how the temptation to massage the numbers would be pretty strong. But how does this lack of transparency affect the rest of the world?
Well, it creates a risky situation for global markets and investors. Businesses and investors rely on accurate data to make informed decisions, but if the information coming out of China is potentially skewed, it's like building a house on a foundation of sand. You just don't know what you're really dealing with.
That makes a lot of sense. And it seems like it's getting even harder to get reliable information. The source mentioned a crackdown on due diligence firms operating in China. Didn't these firms used to play a crucial role in providing insights into the Chinese market?
Absolutely. Many of these firms, often Western or with Western partnerships, offered crucial market research and helped companies navigate the complexities of doing business in China. But the CCP has been tightening its grip on information flow, and these firms have become casualties of that effort.
So it's getting harder for outsiders to get an accurate, unbiased view of the Chinese economy. This feels like a pretty big deal. If we can't rely on the official data and independent analysis is being suppressed, how can anyone make informed decisions about investing in or trading with China? It feels like we're being asked to take a leap of faith.
That's the dilemma, and it has real-world consequences. The source highlighted how analysts are turning to unconventional methods to fill in the gaps left by unreliable data. Did you know they're doing things like counting trucks at Shanghai docks and analyzing Disneyland attendance to glean insights into economic activity?
It sounds like something out of a spy movie. But it also highlights just how desperate people are for reliable information. What kind of insights are they actually getting from these unorthodox methods?
Well, for example, by tracking truck traffic at ports, analysts were able to identify a significant slowdown in exports, which directly contradicted the government's claims of robust export growth. Similarly, by analyzing Disneyland attendance figures, they could get a sense of consumer confidence and spending patterns, which, again, might differ from the official narrative.
So it's not just about finding creative ways to gather data. It's about uncovering information that challenges the official narrative, the story that the Chinese government wants to tell. That's pretty eye-opening.
Exactly. It underscores the importance of critical thinking and looking beyond the surface when it comes to understanding China's economy. We can't simply take things at face value.
All right, so we've established that getting a clear picture of China's economy is a challenge in itself. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the changing landscape for Western businesses operating in China. For years, everyone's been talking about the massive potential of the Chinese market, but it seems like that allure is fading as companies face some pretty serious challenges.
That's right. The cost-benefit analysis of doing business in China is definitely evolving. What was once seen as a no-brainer, tapping into that huge consumer market, is now becoming a much more complex calculation. Western companies are increasingly grappling with issues like intellectual property theft, shifting priorities towards resilience and diversification, and the ever-present challenge of navigating a politically charged environment.
There's a really striking anecdote in the research about an American businessman who was injured by one of those electric buggies that zip around airports. You know the ones I'm talking about.
Ah, yes.
Well, this businessman was actually pressured to pay for the damage to the buggy, even though he was the one who got hurt. It seems hard to believe, but the source claims this kind of thing was not uncommon.
It sounds absurd, but it highlights the lengths companies would go to appease Chinese authorities and avoid rocking the boat, even if it meant sacrificing their own interests. It speaks to the power dynamics at play and the pressure companies feel to conform to a certain way of doing business in China.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark reminder that the rules of the game are different in China. It makes you wonder, how sustainable is this model for Western businesses in the long run? Are the risks starting to outweigh the potential rewards?
That's a key question, and the research suggests that for many companies, the answer is increasingly becoming yes. We're seeing a definite shift in the business landscape. Instead of just focusing on access to the Chinese market, companies are now prioritizing resilience, diversification, and safeguarding their intellectual property.
So instead of putting all their eggs in the China basket, companies are looking for alternatives, spreading their risk and protecting their assets. It sounds like a necessary adaptation, but what kind of impact might this have on the global economy?
Well, these shifts have the potential to significantly impact global supply chains, product availability, and even our personal consumer choices. As companies diversify their operations and reduce their reliance on China, we could see higher prices, delays in product availability, and even a change in the types of goods and services available to us.
That's something we should all be paying attention to. It's a reminder that these seemingly distant economic trends can have very real and tangible effects on our everyday lives. It's fascinating how these global economic shifts can ripple outwards and touch all of our lives. But let's turn our attention now to what's happening within China itself. The research paints a picture of a country facing some significant internal challenges despite its outward projection of strength. It's a bit like a duck gliding across a pond. Everything looks calm and effortless on the surface, but underneath, those little legs are paddling furiously.
That's a great analogy. While China has enjoyed remarkable economic growth over the past few decades, the research points to some underlying vulnerabilities that could threaten its future trajectory. One of the most pressing issues is the property bubble. Remember those ghost cities we talked about earlier? The ones built in anticipation of future demand that never materialized?
Yeah, they're hard to forget. It's mind-boggling to think that so much capital was poured into these projects that now stand empty.
Well, those ghost cities are a symptom of a much larger problem: rampant speculation and overbuilding in the real estate sector. The source highlights that a staggering 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied up in property. To put that in perspective, imagine if 70% of American families had their entire savings invested in the stock market. That's the situation in China with property, and it's a potential time bomb.
Wow, that's a really sobering thought. So what happens if, or perhaps when, that bubble bursts? What are the potential consequences for the Chinese economy?
Well, the consequences could be pretty severe. We're already seeing signs of distress in the property market with falling prices and growing concerns about the financial health of major developers. The collapse of Evergrande, one of China's largest real estate companies, was a major wake-up call, sending shockwaves through global financial markets.
It's like a domino effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
If the property market takes a serious tumble, it could trigger a chain reaction across the entire Chinese economy and potentially spill over into global markets. Are there other vulnerabilities we should be aware of?
Absolutely. The research also highlights soaring youth unemployment as a major concern. At one point, it reached a staggering 20%, which is a recipe for social unrest. And then there's the inherent tension between economic reform and the CCP's need for control.
Right, it seems like a classic catch-22. To maintain its grip on power, the CCP needs to keep a tight rein on information and economic activity. But that very control can stifle innovation and the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that drives dynamic economic growth. So how do they reconcile these competing forces? It seems like a real balancing act.
It is a balancing act, and one that's becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Our expert argues that Xi Jinping's focus on control and security might actually be hindering the very economic reforms that China needs to address these vulnerabilities and maintain its growth trajectory.
That's a really interesting point. So it's not just about external pressures or global economic forces. China's internal policies and political dynamics are also playing a crucial role in shaping its economic future. But how do these internal challenges impact China's global ambitions? Can it really be a dominant force on the world stage if it's struggling with its own economic issues at home?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that experts are grappling with. Some believe that these internal challenges could force China to scale back its global ambitions, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative, which requires vast amounts of capital. Others argue that these challenges could actually make China more assertive and aggressive abroad, as it seeks to distract from its internal problems and project an image of strength on the world stage.
That's a thought-provoking and slightly unsettling idea. Reminds me of that saying, wag the dog, creating a distraction to deflect attention from more pressing issues at home. Is there any evidence to suggest that China might be pursuing this kind of strategy?
Well, history is full of examples of leaders facing domestic unrest, resorting to external conflicts to rally the populace and deflect criticism. And the research does point to some potential warning signs. For example, China's increasingly assertive stance in the South China Sea and its growing military presence in the region could be seen as a way of projecting power and bolstering national pride at a time when the economy is facing headwinds.
So it's not just about economic considerations, it's about political calculations and strategic maneuvering. It seems like we need to be paying close attention to both the economic and geopolitical signals coming out of China. Speaking of uncertainty, that brings us to our final point for today, the uncertain future of China's economy and its leadership. With Xi Jinping consolidating power and these looming economic headwinds, what does the crystal ball tell us? What does the future hold for China?
Unfortunately, predicting China's future is about as reliable as reading tea leaves. Even seasoned China watchers acknowledge that forecasting in a system as opaque as China's is a notoriously difficult task.
So there's a lot we just don't know. But I imagine there are some key factors or trends that experts are watching closely. What are some of the things that could shape China's future trajectory?
One of the biggest unknowns is the issue of succession. Xi Jinping has eliminated term limits, effectively making himself president for life. But what happens after Xi? There's a lack of clear succession planning, and the potential for internal power struggles adds another layer of unpredictability to the mix.
That makes sense. A power vacuum at the top could create a lot of instability. The source even suggests that Xi Jinping himself might be the biggest obstacle to the kind of economic reforms that China needs to address its vulnerabilities.
That's a provocative thought, isn't it? If Xi is seen as the roadblock to change what might happen after his eventual departure, could a power vacuum lead to greater instability? Or could it open the door to much-needed reforms and a new era of economic and political transformation?
It's fascinating to think about the possibilities, both positive and negative. It seems like China is at a crossroads, facing some critical choices that will have a profound impact not only on its own future, but on the world as a whole. It's a lot to wrap our heads around, all this uncertainty swirling around China's future. But before we get lost in the hypotheticals, I think it's important to bring this back down to earth a bit. The research also touches on some very practical considerations for Western nations and businesses when it comes to engaging with China moving forward.
You're absolutely right. Ignoring China is simply not an option. It's too big of a player on the world stage. But engaging with China effectively requires a clear-eyed assessment of the risks and challenges involved.
And it seems like the West might have more leverage in this relationship than we often realize. For years, the prevailing narrative has been that the West needs China more than China needs the West. But the research suggests that this might not be entirely accurate.
That's a crucial point. There's a growing recognition that the balance of power might be shifting and that Western nations have more options than they might think. The source highlights the example of Australia's decision to challenge China by demanding an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19.
Right, and China responded with economic sanctions, essentially trying to punish Australia for daring to question its narrative. But what happened? Did Australia buckle under the pressure?
Not at all. It turns out Australia was able to find alternative markets for its goods, mitigating the impact of China's sanctions. This example demonstrates that China's economic leverage is not absolute, and that countries are finding ways to push back against its assertive tactics.
It's like a game of chess, where we're finally starting to realize that we have more pieces on the board than we thought. We don't have to play by China's rules.
Exactly. It's about being strategic and recognizing that we have options. The source argues that a smart Western policy would focus on several key areas: recognizing and exploiting China's vulnerabilities, reasserting influence with countries that have been neglected in favor of focusing on China, and reducing dependence on China, particularly in critical sectors like technology and supply chains.
It sounds like we need a more nuanced approach to China, one that balances economic engagement with a clear-eyed recognition of the risks and a willingness to stand up for our values and interests. It's not about decoupling entirely, but it is about being more selective, strategic, and resilient.
Absolutely. And that includes recognizing that values matter. We can't ignore human rights abuses, intellectual property theft, and other questionable practices just because it's convenient or profitable to do business with China.
Right. Engaging with China shouldn't come at the expense of our democratic principles or our commitment to human rights. It's about finding that delicate balance between economic opportunity and safeguarding our values.
Well said. And that's where our deep dive comes to an end. We've covered a lot of ground, from the intricacies of China's data dilemma to the challenges facing Western businesses to the internal vulnerabilities and the uncertain future of China's leadership. Hopefully, we've equipped you with a better understanding of this complex and rapidly evolving landscape.
It's certainly given me a lot to think about. And I think the key takeaway here is that there are no easy answers. Engaging with China effectively requires a deep understanding of its complexities, a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, and a commitment to our own values and interests.
Indeed. And that's where you, our listener, come in. Now that you've had this deep dive into the research, we encourage you to continue your exploration. What aspects of China's influence are most relevant to your life or work? How do you think these trends will shape the future?
These are questions we all need to grapple with. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll leave you with one final thought. Knowing what we've discussed today, how should Western nations and businesses approach engagement with China moving forward? Is there a balance to be struck between economic opportunity and safeguarding democratic values?
The answers are far from simple, but by asking the right questions, engaging in informed debate, and recognizing the complexities involved, we can navigate this challenging terrain and make choices that align with our values and our interests.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.